Arizonans. The battle in the night was won by us, if you can call it a win. Many down in the forward trench were killed, but the valley fire cut off any chance of the Legion coming to help their mates. As the trench crews and ranger snipers picked off the last of the Legion, it turned out that some were captured. After a troop rotation with those from the trench, we heard stories of the terrible fight. According to the trench crew, as the Legion's buddies started falling left and right and the fire grew, some of them started cutting their own throats in the middle of battle. As this happened, some of the bigger troopers managed to restrain 2 of them. Of the who knows how many legionaries to assault the trench, only 2 were captured and brought back up to the camp resisting the whole time. I was fortunate enough to keep distant during their struggle, but was unfortunate enough to be tasked with watching over them in a cell. An impromptu holding cell was constructed in the camp fortification that was mostly reserved for our troops who might do the wrong thing in their service. We had yet to lock up any of our own people, so the Legion captives were locked away while me and a female trooper named Corporal Benson were to keep watch over them as command figured out what to do. I tuned out most of the insults thrown my way, holding my rifle across my lap while more focused on the structural stability of the scrap metal jail shack. I sort of felt like a slight breeze could knock the thing over, but that never happened, even as the Legion captives shook the bars and banged their heads on them. Not entirely sure if the frenzied guys in crimson on the opposite side of the bars were talking to me. I heard the corporal getting flustered. She tried to hold it together and called them skirt boys and other names while they threatened to do things to her that I'm too modest to describe. The skirt boys pushed all the right buttons of the corporal because she soon left, saying that if she had to be there a second longer, she'd break the rules of war. After hearing some of the things the legionaries said, I didn't blame her. She left, and the fellas in red turned their attention to me. I didn't mind all the garbage they said to me because I knew I'd be pretty ticked off too if I was captured by the Legion. Although, I don't think we had any plans to crucify them. A minute later, the corporal never returned, but was instead replaced by a male sergeant who took a seat right next to me to watch the cell. The sergeant asked what the trouble was, and I just told the NCO how these captives were being pretty mean to the corporal and that I've just been ignoring them. The man looked at me like I was an idiot for not partaking in the mudslinging, but I insisted that they were just upset and venting about their recent capture. Again, I was looked at like an absolute moron. The 2 behind the bars were cussing up a storm, and the sergeant batted the bars with a baton, giving every insult the female corporal wasn't able to formulate. I didn't feel that there was any use in arguing with people who'd already lost based on their location within the jail shack, so I remained quiet. As the sergeant indulged in berating the legionaries, I instead simply watched them. I thought it was fairly interesting, the whole getup they had on. Red tunics, black skirts, and combat boots. I wondered why the man who killed Private First Class Dawn was so much bigger, because these 2 didn't look like much. The way they occasionally patted their torsos, arms, and heads in between bouts of psychosis almost made it seem like they felt naked. I guess that the absence of their blades and armor and exposed faces made them even more crazy and mean than the evil beast that killed Dawn. Another interesting thing about the 2 was that when I was alone, they never insulted me for any sort of immutable characteristic of mine. The white and black legionaries called me things like weak, immoral, pathetic, and vile, all of which were things I could theoretically work on. Eventually, the sergeant had tired himself out of the insultathon and left saying that he was going to see what the game plan was regarding these degenerates. Again, the deranged duo yelled at me and bloodied their fists or heads by smacking the bars. I ignored them yet again. For several minutes, they shouted insults at me and said what they were going to do if they got out. Like I said, it was easy to ignore them, especially since I was the one with a rifle across my lap. Since they got nowhere with me, one of the prisoners threw himself down into the corner and began punching himself in the jaw repeatedly, while the other still leaned on the bar staring at me. Finally, the psychotic legionary who was staring at me spoke the first words that weren't an insult. The guy looked at me through the bars and asked bluntly, "Why don't you stand up for yourself?" The very fact that what he said wasn't an insult or threat caught my attention, so I felt my face twist to surprise as I said, "I don't really need to. You're the guys who got captured." There was a long pause as the man watched me with the same face. He finally said in a non-psychotic and fairly reasonable way, "Fair enough." Now it was my turn to be upset with the way the guy wasn't talking. I asked, "Why's your pal hitting himself in the face?" He didn't turn around, but I watched the sitting prisoner still punching his jaw. The standing prisoner said, "We didn't get a chance to kill ourselves before capture, so he's making sure he won't be able to talk." I saw the sitting prisoner's jaw was contorted horrifically as the punches got weaker and asked, "Well, what about you? Looks like he's about tuckered out. Are you up next?" He said, "I'll do what I need to do when the time comes." Just then, his buddy had knocked himself out, and the blood poured from his disfigured jaw. I thought out loud, was I supposed to stop that? And the conscious legionary snickered in a way that I couldn't tell if he found what I said funny or pathetic. A few minutes passed, and the other trooper hadn't come back yet. Time went by slowly, and idleness finally got the better of me. I asked the prisoner, who still stood in the same spot, and staring at me with the same face, "So, where you guys from?" I think Caesar would let you answer that question. I caught the expression of the man again, and even though his eyes in the dim room said he wanted to chop my head off, he answered, "Arizona." I said, amusingly, "No kidding. Never been there myself. Only left the coast a few months ago. I think it was a few months ago." There was silence from the other side of the bars. I finally asked another question. "What's Caesar like? Ever meet him?" I could tell the guy didn't like my questions, but I got another answer. "I never had the honor to meet Lord Caesar. But if you unlock the door, he'll forgive my capture when I slaughter you and everyone in this camp. Then I should be able to meet him." I gave a nod. "I'll have to take your word on that, but the door's staying shut." Honestly, I really didn't care for the way he and his friend were so belligerent. Coupled with his threat to me when I had been nothing but cordial since engaging with him, I was pretty ticked off. I asked, "Why are you and your pal so crazy? It isn't like we're gonna crucify you," he said plainly, still unmoving from the spot he'd been standing for 5 minutes. "You should." I was going to tell him that I'd run the idea up the chain of command, but instead asked, "Why?" Again, his eyes were filled with hate, and his body was a statue. "To see if it works. I can tell you it won't, though." I asked, "If what will work?" He responded with more than a sentence or word, "Why do you think we do what we do? Why do you think we leave your friends to die in the sun? Why do you think we profanity your women, enslave your children, and butcher those under your protection?" I thought back to a sacked town poster with that guy's face on it that said, "This is what evil looks like," but felt your evil was too shallow of an answer. I asked curiously, "Why is that?" A grin grew across his stone face as he said, "Because it works on you. Look at what we've done with our presence in Nelson alone. Every day, you'll fight to survive, grow weaker and weaker, and see your nightmares each night become more and more real with every friend you watch get hauled up on a cross. You'll constantly know what is coming for you." I was honestly taken aback by the dramatic way he talked, but asked, "And why won't it work if we did that stuff to you?" His grin grew even more wolf-like before he answered, "Because we want to be here." I didn't expect that to be the answer, so I let out a simple, "Okay." He said, "Look at your comrades. Look at yourself. You were drafted or blindly volunteered to help the profligates of this desert, only to watch all your friends die slowly and horribly." With thoughts and stories about the Legion, I interrupted the prisoner. "Well, weren't you drafted or something into the Legion?" I heard Caesar's army is all slaves. Face unchanging from that grin, he said proudly, "You're right, I was saved by Lord Caesar." I thought, "Ensaved, but sat there blankly, almost feeling his grin at this point. He finally added, "You want what you want. You are selfish, only loyal to yourself and those around you. You don't want to be in this desert. I only have one desire in life, and that is what Lord Caesar demands of me. Caesar wants the Mojave. I want the Mojave. You and your nation don't." Just then, the trooper came back with a squad of guards. After asking me what happened to the other prisoner, I told him. He was right. I should have tried to stop him from beating his own jaw and knocking himself out. But there was little I could do since it was just me in there. The contingent of guards easily bound the prisoner I was chatting with. and brought in a stretcher for the other one. The trooper asked what I did to make the other one so docile, but I just said they tuckered themselves out after a long night. As the conscious Legion prisoner was escorted out, his grinning face never turned from me, even while he was being bound. Last I heard, those two were escorted to Camp McCarran near New Vegas, and I never heard their fates. 100 yards out. Each day, the line was tense whether or not the Legion attacked. Rotations on the observation line and the trench line during this point only continued in day-long shifts. I had the fortune of never being on the trench line during any of the attacks. Legion raids were almost weekly, with usually no more than 2 bloody occasions within that time frame. Most of the men didn't know why the Legion was holding Nelson, if all their troops were going to be just staying around there for the most part. Although, I think my brief talk with the Legion prisoner told why. They just wanted to show us they were there. I ended up talking with some of my mates around the fires about that incident, and word spread. I didn't buy into much of the prisoner's talk, but others took what I described as an omen or something. Without any real intel on the Legion at Nelson, the command at Camp Hope put that as the official statement on reports. Legion was here to demoralize us. It worked on many. So, many of the lads knew a person or two that was up on a distant cross, and the Ranger sharpshooters were kept busy logging the departing Legion groups from Nelson. But an official order was given to the sharpshooters to kill any NCR troops they see on a cross. It wasn't long before the Legion smartened themselves up and brought the crosses further out of range. The whole thing was the beginning of a cycle. As raids hit us, troopers were hauled away, and later saved by the Ranger snipers. The raids got bad, and it wasn't long before the command started assembling volunteers for assault squads or Ranger-led mercy teams. The assault squads were to move under the cover of night and engage the legionaries at the fringe of no man's land in order to keep them on the defensive instead of the offensive. At the same time, the Rangers got a bit closer, and we used our blind fire into the night while those Rangers took out any living soul on a cross. As awful as that sounds, it was considered mercy, because there was no way of getting close enough to bring them down without all of Nelson falling on us. Just one of those tragic things that lost its weight over enough times. I volunteered for one of those first night ops. The whole thing was a fairly sophisticated process, if not a little wasteful of resources. So, we crawled through the no man's land with 15 other troops in the dead of night. Under the barbed wire and around the mine craters, we laid in the dirt as the grenade rifles pounded the earth behind us. The confused legionary sentries didn't know what was happening, and they were even more puzzled when our line used the brief silence to fire a full magazine. I didn't know if I was hitting anything as I aimed at the blackness, but the legionaries fell back to gather more troops. Arriving at the scene, we expended the rest of our ammo, making them cower before a charge. At the staff sergeant's call, we fell back to the camp as the Legion took to the offensive. I bet they were surprised when our grenade rifles on the observation line covered our retreat with over a dozen explosions. That was one of the first raids, and the tactic seemed to work, at least until the boys in red adapted. A week later, I found myself volunteering for another assault squad, but was replaced by some rule breaker whose punishment was my spot. I suppose I shouldn't have been too bummed, because that assault squad was met by several dozen legionaries lying in no man's land, waiting for them. Not a single one of our fellows returned, and assault squads were then only permitted to engage 100 yards from the trench line. The 100-yard line became a legendary assignment that I'd been on plenty of times, but was not one you volunteered for. So, during one raid, something very unfortunate happened. The assault squad met the Legion 100 yards into no man's land, but had to fall back to the trench line. The whole thing was really just a tragic event of poor timing on both sides of the no man's land that everyone learned from. In the confusion and volley from those below, half the squad was captured. Also, 6 troopers were marked as dead when 3 men and 3 women were dragged into the night by the chaos on the lines. This was the first time any women troopers were captured by the Legion at the camp, and what happened was just horrible. When morning came, the 3 unfortunate men were strung up on a cross out of sniper range, but the women were nowhere to be seen. My turn, 100 yards out, finally came around again for something I didn't do, and we crawled out into no man's land. Under the cover of night, and just before we began our 100-yard crawl, the Legion gave us the women back, just not in the same condition. Helmet in the dirt. We crawled forward over the bomb craters and wire until my pal on the line whispered that he found something. We were spread at 10-yard intervals, but he asked me to bring a flashlight over. This was unusual, but finding something in no man's land that didn't appear to be razor wire or sand interested me. I shuffled over to him, smelling something unique. We all wore our face coverings out in no man's, so the smell wasn't overwhelming, just different. Also, I had nothing to compare the strange smell to. Plopping myself next to the trooper, he pointed at something pitch black on the desert floor. He prodded it, saying it was squishy, and I shined the light inches above it. It was skin. As my light showed more and more of what we were looking at, the smell suddenly made sense, and it was outright horrible. I wanted to throw up, but managed to hold it back as the trooper passed word down the line to the sergeant. The body of a woman was half buried in the dirt, naked, and horribly disfigured. Other troopers adjusted in their spots in the no man's land and reported more strange smells and things found in the sand. The 3 bodies of the women were buried in the dune of the 100-yard position and facing towards the trench line. I guess the Legion wanted to tell us that they knew where our forces positioned ourselves in the night and show the trench line what happened to the women if discovered when morning finally came. How the Legion found the time to do the awful deed, I don't know, but 100-yard squads were sent out before dusk after that. Each mutilated and naked body was half buried in the sand, rotting, and looking right at Camp Hope in a terrible display made only worse in the mind of my buddy who discovered it by laying prone on its squishy surface. Rangers eventually came down to help excavate the bodies, and the Grenadiers provided a distraction when they were ready to haul them up the cliff. By that point, there were 2 more quiet hours on the 100-yard line. The Legion didn't feel the need to attack that night. It was also around this time that orders were being put in place to remove women from the frontline camp. God only knew what the Legion did to the women they captured, but the bodies in the sand told us that it simply wasn't good. It was after that particular event where Camp Hope started being almost regularly referred to by the Nevada spring it was built upon. Camp Forlorn Hope. Off the line. When troopers weren't on the observation line, trench line, or 100 yards out, life at Camp Hope was steadily earning its common name. The incident with the women, and the survivors of raids in the southern Mojave, cemented the order of removal. It was only a short time after uncovering those bodies left for us that all the women were taken away from the camp. The Legion at Nelson saw this mass displacement of troops, and immediately took the opportunity to attack that night. With nearly a quarter of our troopers gone, we held on, but it wasn't easy. Rotations on the lines were 12 on, 12 off, and life was even harder for another full week or so before we got relief from Hoover Dam and the big solar station north of Novak. Losing the female troopers and having a sick bay full of wounded gave the camp an ominous presence which definitely aided in the adoption of that new camp name. Still though, with the fresh male troops, and us being veterans of the misery, a new culture and sense of camaraderie was starting to develop. Once the new troopers arrived, the 12 on, 12 off was over, and things returned to a sense of normalcy, but with a lack of charm and character brought by the opposite sex. When I wasn't on the observation, trench, or 100-yard line, life was bad but comforting. It sounds strange, I know. Days in a frontline camp started to blend together with the monotony of military procedure at a place that's seen more action in its short history than the total Battle of Hoover Dam. It's true that Camp Hope had been around since the beginning of NCR involvement in the Mojave, but it was really just an observation post. As I showed in the chapter around Nelson, we built the place up into an actual camp. I guess fate smiled on us since it was up and running just in time for the fall of Nelson. But since that event, conditions and battle fatigue took a toll on everything. By this time, we fended off frequent raids. Morale was low, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. So, trooper life fell into 3 types that rotated every week unless their nights were interrupted by conscription onto the 100-yard line. The 3 average weeks were those, off the line, and on the line. The reason for the number 3 was because there were 2 types of on the line. So, a typical day in the life of a trooper off the line went something like this. The trooper awakes at 5 a.m. for brief unit exercises with their squads, unless they were already awake from Nighttime guard duty beforehand. After the basic exercises, a company-wide muster formation is called up, and we stand there until our platoon leader gets accountability and our sergeant inspects our weapons for any potential issues regarding cleanliness or functionality. Then, the sick call is given, which was a part of the muster where troopers were given the opportunity to try and convince one of the medics how sick they were. Miraculously, 99.99% of those who claim ailments aren't sick in even the slightest, at least by the medic standards. After failing to convince the doctors you are too sick for duty, the platoons form up for chow. There is a mess hall shack at the camp made of scrap metal and sadness, but due to limited seating, most troopers eat at community campfires, on a comfy patch of dirt, or near their squad's tent. Meals typically consisted of some sort of maize ration from local farmsteads, dry salted meat from ranches back home, and 200-year-old beans collected over time and thrown into a giant dirty pot. Occasionally, there was bread. Bread was such a rarity that nobody even cared how hard it was or if there was any mold on it. Breakfasts were also good because of the thin cuts of bighorn bacon thrown on the cook's grill by the crate load. The smell of that meat cooking could pull people from their guard posts, but that's what NCOs were for. Much like all the food, or bits of rare food items, when your company was allowed to eat and your platoon dismissed, you had to get there fast if you wanted anything at all. After the morning meal, the platoons were rallied again while one squad is sent to deliver the mess hall scraps to the troopers on the lines. When they return, the platoon is then dismissed again into squads. You and your squad had to check out your squad's assignment listing on the duty roster in the center of camp that told you what you and your fellows were going to do for 8 hours. The assignments were various and differed in big and small ways, but were always assigned 2 squads out of the 8 per company. If your squad wasn't assigned to one duty, you'll get one of the others. I'll give the basics. Guard duty was the first listing, which was essentially a scaled-down version of what goes on at the lines. Guard duty consisted of squads getting dispersed across the camp to various points along the trails into camp, or positions along the Colorado. To do what, though? You guessed it, guard. Not much happened at many of the guard posts, and that was just fine by everyone posted there. Most of the combat was seen by the rangers in the watch posts, and was the problem of those on one of the lines. If you had this job, you pretty much had a free day where you could do whatever you and your pals wanted, aside from leave your post. All you had to do was look busy watching for hostiles when the LT made his rounds every 45 minutes. The next duty assignment was a patrol. Patrols were fairly decent, provided your patrol route wasn't along the no man's land. Most of the routes broke squads into groups of 3 or 4, and took them through the mountainous passes north or west of the camp. A lot of the snaking paths through narrow canyons were a short 2-mile round-trip hike, but many groups stuck fairly close to the base as the sun came down in order to not miss a second of the next part of the day. Somehow, and despite the narrow passes, the sun always seemed to sneak its way down and focus on you regardless the time of day. There are few overcast days in the Mojave, and patrols usually became pretty awful as the sun beat down overhead. If combat wasn't the most common source of casualties at Camp Forlorn Hope, heat stroke was. It also became a great excuse to get out of the 100-yard squad or any other billet a trooper didn't enjoy. So many troopers got sunstroke during this time, intentionally or not, that getting it, or failing to hydrate, eventually became a punishable crime. After that, mandatory canteen drinking became part of the unit musters. Intentional cases leveled out. But due to the notoriously horrible heat of the Mojave and NCR tax dollars spent on saving the recently dehydrated, the most overused term of NCR troopers was coined. If you ever say the phrase, patrolling the Mojave almost makes you wish for a nuclear winter to any trooper that served in the Mojave, one of 2 things will happen. Either they will laugh at the common joke, fondly remembering their service in a less terrible part of the desert, or they'll get really mad, remembering how horribly real but overused the statement was at Forlorn Hope, and punch you in the mouth, having heard the phrase whined 10 billion times. I can't say for sure which I'd do. So, the next squad assignment was alert duty. 2 squads of a company were designated alert duty. This essentially had troops running between patrol groups or guard posts, command tent, etc., to relay messages since radios weren't too common for the regular infantry outside of HQ. This was another great source of heat stroke victims. Although 3 troopers from the 2 squads would be assigned to one of the rangers in the watchtowers, I think the rangers were usually too busy sniping any Legion raid groups to fire a flare themselves, so it was up to a lowly private or PFC to take that role in a tower. I already described one of my experiences on alert duty in a tower, but that was during our company's time on the line, where a crew from the line held the job at night. During the day, it was a task taken up by the off-the-line company. Getting a spot in a tower was an interesting predicament that the squads assigned alert duty found themselves in. Troopers sometimes fought each other to get the tower post, since it was usually a pretty decent gig when compared to running messages around the camp all day. Not only were the watch posts shaded, so there was no need to give yourself heat stroke, but the rangers were usually very interesting people, unless you got saddled with one who's got an ego. The last assignment on the duty roster was the reserve unit. The 2 remaining squads of a company off the line had the task of sitting near the command tent and twiddling their thumbs. This group was there to fill in wherever something was lacking, or help with any other type of camp issue. For example, an HQ officer or NCO discovers the latrine pits are full, so he collects 3 idlers, reserve troops, to hurl buckets of waste off the cliff to the Colorado. This act is usually preceded by the famous phrase, "Give me 3," which means 3 of you must volunteer, or I will draft 3 of you for the terrible job I have in mind myself. The 3 almost never give themselves over, which usually leads to the 3 troopers praying their hardest to not be involved getting voluntold. Or, every member of the alert duty is out running messages, so he tasks 2 idlers to run a message down to the trench line, 1 to carry the message, and 1 to collect the body if the courier gets heat stroke. The tasks of the reserve duty vary in awfulness. Sometimes it's taking waste to the cliff. Sometimes it's helping the logistics guys from McCarran unload the ammo. Sometimes it's helping clear ants off the field surgeon's unconscious patients, or even hauling up and burying the dead after a raid on the trench line. Although, this task was predominantly the job of a specially designated recovery team. Regardless, most troopers preferred guard duty over the reserve unit. At least there, they only have to look busy every now and then, as opposed to constantly await the terrible words, "Give me, number." Again, this is life, off the line, so I'll have a special section for duties and details about life, on the lines. Instead of going into the life of a trooper on the line, I'll explain the rest of the trooper's typical day away from the trenches. After the squad is done with their 8-hour task, it's usually around 5 or 6 p.m., and there is another muster formation. The company forms up in the center of camp, and roll call is again taken once the patrol groups finally come back. Weapons are checked yet again, but for functionality mostly, due to Mojave sand and dirt that uglies up your weapon regardless of assignment. After that, there is evening chow. You read that correctly. There are only 2 authorized meals. Lunches are encouraged to be eaten on the job. A trooper is expected to stuff some kind of breakfast remains in his pockets for consumption throughout the day. I've eaten pocket sand speckled meat and vegetables too many times in my life. At the end of chow, another squad is conscripted to deliver the cook's reserve to the guys on the lines, while the platoons form for another accountability formation. After the evening chow, there is usually more food to dish out since the day's heat has a way of screwing with your appetite despite what your assignment was. So, that task usually takes an hour or so. Upon return of the food deliverers, then begins the designated free time. After the evening meal, the designated rest period is 1 hour, and basically serves as a camp-wide reserve unit. A trooper is free to write home, play games, clean up themselves or their weapons, or stew about how awful joining the NCR infantry turned out to be. I say that it's a big reserve unit because during that time, troopers are up for grabs by whatever officer or NCO needs them. Upon dismissal of that evening formation, the unit immediately begins a game of hide from your superiors. Camp Forlorn Hope wasn't too big a place, but troopers had found some pretty creative places to hide from their company or HQ staff. I remember once paling around with some of the lads behind the jail shack when I saw an officer shouting for a trooper's attention. We whipped towards the man, but he wasn't talking to us. He was shouting up at the western cliff where a trooper had scaled nearly 2 stories of rock to a little nook where he thought he'd be safe. The only reason he was seen was because the moon was high above near the end of the free period, and a lone rifle barrel was silhouetted where he hid. The trooper had to climb down the entire jagged wall and was tasked as an addition to the 100-yard squad. I never knew the trooper's name since he was part of 1st Platoon, but I believe he died a few weeks later. Anyway, there were countless other places people used to keep from having to serve during the rest period, and new troopers to Forlorn Hope learned really quickly that tents weren't safe. I can't tell you how many times I've seen some new trooper writing to his dear old mom on his cot, only to be dragged out of there to run a pointless or dangerous errand. I learned fairly quickly that if you and a few buds sat on the camp edge of the observation line, you were often mistaken for a trooper in the company tasked to that line. Although, that was still a risky place because most higher-ups knew that the majority of troopers on the observation line were asleep during that time, despite the few night sentries. More on that later. After the short window of freedom, squads had to immediately go to their tents for lights out, unless you got put in the 100-yard squad. There was hardly any power at the camp, but lights out meant you better be in your cot when the night watch members came around. If you weren't there, you ran the risk of getting charged with abandoning your post. The night watch was a squad of the company selected randomly to check beds and stand guard around their company's section of Forlorn Hope. It was usually only 2 at a time, changing every hour, and reporting directly to an HQ officer whose duty was making sure their checks were honest. Considering squads usually weren't more than 6 troopers, members of the night watch almost never had more than 2 hours of continuous sleep during their assigned nights. Then, the unit would wake up at 5 a.m. again and start once more. I said at the start of this section that this applied to troopers whose company wasn't on one of the lines. I'll get to that shortly. What I may have described may not seem that bad, but there were several conditions I hadn't mentioned or glossed over. Between constant heat, meager rations, ants, critters, worry about doing something punishable, getting heat stroke, becoming sick, getting ordered around, and fearing an attack by those gentlemen at Nelson. Those things take a toll on a man, especially when it's your life, day after day after day. As soon as monotony possesses your physical and mental being, your company rotates to one of the lines. Then, a whole new set of circumstances is there to consider. I will admit that the rotation keeps things interesting. If you get tired of one set of gloom, you can look forward to the next set. On the line, observation. There were 3 infantry companies, and 1 HQ company that consisted of the base's command officers at Camp Forlorn Hope. Part of that HQ company was a platoon dedicated to weapons specialists like the Grenadiers, a logistics squad, and 1 for medical troopers. The HQ company Grenadiers were almost constantly on the observation line, but each infantry company rotated. When one was off the line, they did what I described in the previous section, while the other 2 were on the line. Each rotation occurred in 1-week intervals. The company off the line was busy and had its own problems, but the 2 different lines were wildly different. Most troopers felt the observation line was the best rotation, and I was inclined to agree. I'll explain why in a bit, but the worst weeks were always on the trench line. I'll again explain why in a bit. When a company was assigned to the observation line, it was basically one giant guard duty. Both platoons were stacked up against the barricades and sandbags with rifles above the no man's land aimed at Nelson. It was great to know that if the Legion attacked, they'd have to work through the trench line and then scale the winding path just to reach us. The company up top was safe, but it came with its own set of issues. It may not sound like an issue with all things considered, but boredom was a big issue most of the times that I was there. There were some exciting occasions, but most of the tensest moments for troops on the observation line were when I was off the line patrolling the western passes and fighting heat stroke. I may sound too flippant about the idea of being in the fray, but danger wasn't the only reason troopers across the Mojave dreaded the idea of coming to Forlorn Hope. I mentioned some of the boredom in previous sections, but the stale moments on regular guard duty were only slightly alleviated on the observation line by the fact that an entire company was in the same place. Though boredom is a preferable alternative to going below, most of the problem troopers got their punishments on the observation line. I'll explain those punishments in a different section, but I'll give whoever is reading this a watered-down example of what the boredom of safety and a lack of action can do. You ever play the game rock, paper, scissors for 3 hours straight? For those who don't know, rock, paper, scissors is a game where you and a partner simultaneously use your hands to make symbols that represent either a rock, a sheet of paper, or a pair of scissors. In the game, rock beats scissors, paper beats rock, and scissors beats paper. Both players say the words rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Just as the word shoot is said, both players make one of the 3 gestures. One player will win regardless of the scenario, and a winner is determined almost instantly. The game lasts slightly less than 3 seconds on average before both players can go again or stop. Now, play that with a willing participant for 3 hours straight and see how sane you come out. As I was saying, Legion often attacked in the night, so most of the days were boring nothingness. During the day, 3 of the squads on the observation line are tasked with nighttime guard duty, so they are authorized sleep at around 1 p.m. in order to eat chow and immediately go to the posts around camp that the off-the-line troops watch during the day, keep watch on Nelson atop the line, or join a ranger in one of the towers. Those guys, part of the night crew, are given the difficult task of sleeping in the Mojave sun, but that helps them stay out of trouble while everyone else suffers throughout the daily boredom. So, troopers not asleep on the observation line use that time to get themselves into trouble or stay occupied in a myriad of ways. Even though the majority of sitting through heat was boring, and thus led to rock, paper, scissors marathons, troopers kept their thoughts together through other activities like playing cards, complaining, telling stories from their time at better camps, writing, and so forth. I'll talk more about the ways morale is kept up in a different section, but on the observation line, some of that fun is ended when someone snaps and starts a fight, when the heat gets the better of someone, or if someone has had it with the ants. Ants were probably the biggest issue other than the heat, but were also a source of entertainment if you found the right one. Again, more on that later. A good chunk of the day on the observation line is spent batting ants off your body or off the body of your poor friend who is sleeping before his night watch. Due to those critters, as well as other miserable conditions at the camp, uniform conditions were much more lax than I heard other stations were. For instance, it wasn't uncommon for the bulk of troopers up top to cast their brown dust jackets aside for better ventilation. A lot of troopers didn't even wear the top half of their tan coveralls. Like, I rolled mine down and rarely even wore my undershirt. Instead, I spent most of the days up there with only my leather chest protector and steel helmet covering my top half. Though only wearing a bottom half of the uniform, my skin was an easier feast for ants. But that was worth it due to the nice breeze that drifted under the heavy chest protector. Although, not everyone could do that since lighter-skinned fellas got themselves roasted by the sun, and instead only went half-kit in order to batter ants out of their undershirts. Whether their time on the observation line was spent staying busy, staying miserable, or coping with the unchangeable. Every trooper on that line knows that it doesn't matter the time of day or night when the order, send them out, can be called. Each squad of the 5 awake ones rotates a man to pop his head up every 120 seconds along the line, differing by squad, to actually observe from the observation line. Though counting the seconds is a great way to stay occupied, or go insane, the rest of the troops along the line are to stay down, doing what I described above. If one of the observers along the line sees something, or if a ranger sniper starts firing, rock, paper, scissors marathons are ended immediately. A Legion scouting team from Nelson is occasionally seen a bit too close to no man's land, and one of the observers will shout the words, "Send him out." Once the order is called, every trooper along the line, including those trying to sleep before the night guard, throw their rifles onto the sandbags and use one full magazine shooting at anything south that isn't brown or tan. As the guns thunder left and right, the dust settles, the smoke clears, and either a distant Legion team is running back to Nelson or the trooper gets brought up on charges. I should explain. Ammunition is expensive. So, when around 50 troopers along the observation line fire at the ghost or tumbleweed a skittish trooper saw, it isn't good. The average trooper's rifle carries a 20-round magazine. That's a lot of wasted ammo. Then, word has to go down to the tents and ready trench line to tell everyone it was nothing. If it's your turn to count, and if you see something during your peek, you better be sure that you see Legion. I honestly believe skittish troopers on the observation line are the reason for Camp Forlorn Hope's later ammo shortage. Before things got really bad, and after enough false alarms, it eventually became standard protocol for troopers up top to only have a half magazine with only 10 shots, loaded into their weapon. That was still dangerous considering the volley from up top would be shorter if there was an actual threat, but worth it in case of false alarm. After firing 10 shots as fast and accurate as you can, you dump the magazine and load in a fresh one, mentally taking a bet during the brief pause on whether the guys below encounter something. Despite the Legion's rare attacks in the day, some Legion raids aren't full-scale assaults like during the storms or at night. More on that in the next section. Some of those daytime raids seen by observers or ranger snipers are a crafty group of Legion gunners who dirtied up their red uniforms in order to crawl close enough to start harassing those in the trench. Either way, if the trooper gave a false order to fire, the trooper is then punished, usually by getting put 100 yards out come nighttime, or later assigned to a raid squad. So, like I said, most of the time on the observation line was keeping your head down, battling boredom and Mother Nature, counting, trying to sleep in the hot sand and blazing sun, or getting into the trouble I'll discuss later. Soon enough, your company's week of safety on the cliff was over, and you moved down to the trench line. On the line, trench. A week on the trench line was pretty terrible. If I wasn't clear during the previous sections, the trench line was at the foot of the winding path up to the observation line, and at the edge of no man's land. Sitting in the shallow trench down below made you on edge all day. Between the trench line and the town of Nelson was about 3/4 of a mile of open land filled with ash, sand dunes, and mine blast craters. I remembered early on when the no man's land was a pretty little valley full of shrubs and liveliness. By this point, I don't think anyone remembered what it was before the desolate plain of sand, wire, and death. Again, squads were reserved to keep watch at night, while the others kept watch during the day. Even though the Legion typically attacked at night, the days were scariest for a reason. At night, the 100-yard squad was sent out, so the night crews on the trench line knew that they were safe, unless those guys out there started firing. The reason the days were scariest was because of the frequent dust storms across the Mojave that usually occurred during the day hours. When a dust storm came rolling in, the Legion walked right into it and kept low, staying concealed by the bomb craters and dunes of ash and sand. Every eye was covered with goggles, but even though we had mines out there, we knew that a Legion raid could storm our line at any moment, and there was nothing the guys on the observation line could do if they couldn't even see us. As I mentioned, the Legion frequently visited us in the night, but I say those dust storms were when we got the worst of it. Aside from the 100-yard crew at night, the Rangers on Overwatch had night vision goggles in their fancy helmets and could usually alert the trench line if they were coming. Then, the flares get shot, and both the observation and trench lines gave them everything. There was no counter to a dust storm, and that made us in the trench the only thing the boys in red were able to safely get to. The time in the trench is spent waiting and hoping to at least be ready when the Legion inevitably attacked. The line below was also only about waist deep, and that meant that much of the day was spent hunched over to avoid the legionary gunners that occasionally focused on the trench line. I forgot to explain that the Legion sharpshooters were the reason that the guys on the observation line only peeked up sporadically. We had our own snipers, but Legion explorers knew how to get close and put a well-placed shot or two on our guys without the snipers getting alerted. Even though the Legion preferred their attacks with spears and machetes, they weren't shy about shooting at us with whatever they had available during their raids. Days on the trench line were not only more dangerous, but they were a lot busier than those on the observation line. If you weren't scanning the sand dunes of no man's land, embracing the Mojave heat, trying to sleep before the night watch, or watching the recent captives die on a distant cross, you were running a job. There was plenty to do in the trench line, and the worst jobs included joining a wire team, a trapper team, or a recovery team. The time in which these jobs took place differed almost weekly due to some unfortunate event or another. The best a trooper below could do was hope that their time on a team wouldn't be one of those incidents. Wire duty originally started in the day. That command thought was safest. A team made up of volunteers or people voluntold. would crawl out into the no man's land and fix the different lines of wire out there. The team started out at the 150-yard marker, then worked their way back to the 150 and ended at the wire just beyond the line. Hot sand, long sleeves, merciless sun, and heavy rolls of wire were not fun to work with in the day. After the heatstroke victims, an occasional trooper picked off by a Legion Explorer team, the job was moved to the night. After crawling out past the 100-yard squad to the 150 marker, the troopers got to work, and that worked well for a while. At least until Command remembered that the Legion also attacked at night. Bottom line, there was no good time for any of the trench line jobs. During the day, troopers were shot by the Legion around Nelson or fell victim to the sun. During the night, the Legion attacked just in time to gut the wire teams before even reaching the 100-yard squad. So, after the first few night incidents that ended with more crucifixes or graves on the cliff, Command made wire teams work during the dust storms. Another brilliant decision. I probably don't need to explain why it was bad to make the lightly armed wire teams work their duties during the dust storms if you read the paragraphs above. However, despite the Legion's love of dust, the concealment offered time to work that was seen as a good thing by the brass. Considering again that the Legion took advantage of every dust storm to attack, this idea seemed horrible in the eyes of U.S. troopers. Although, I will tell you the reason that this tactic was adopted, because I was there. After griping with the change in procedure, our company moved down below. So, we waited on the trench line after hearing the weather report, watching the no man's land, and waiting for that wall of dust from the west to hit us when Sarge tossed me a heavy spool of rolled up barbed wire, a tool satchel, a pea-shooter handgun, and said, "Strap yourself up, Harton. You're fixing up the 150 mark." I told him, like heck I am, in my mind as I threw on the heavy roll covered in a tan blanket. Wouldn't you know it? 2 days into our week on the trench line, I was assigned to the wire team during the first trial of a trench job during a dust storm. I already had my will written, so there was no need for legitimate protest on my part. The rest of the wire team gathered around me with 2 more unfortunate mobile spools, and 3 others to defend us with their sidearms. By the time we were all ready, the storm just started to hit us, and the visibility into no man's land was dropped to about 75 yards, then 50, then 25 yards. The new order had us head out when we couldn't see more than 10 yards. So, when that was the case, our goggles were firmly on, and we began our crawl out to the different barbed wire markers. We crawled for several minutes, spread by 15 feet, and passed the 50 marker. When we reached the 100, I saw tiny movements just barely behind that marker, and stopped. I can't say for sure what the rest of the team did, but I stayed still. I stayed so still that I was essentially holding onto the earth just to brace the winds. Moments passed, and I felt my legs slowly getting buried by the storm that increased by the second. Through the whirlwind, I heard a loud pang and kept my head down. The wire on the 100 marker snapped. I couldn't see what happened in the noise's direction, but I kept my head down and threw an audio cone made by my helmet and the dirt. I heard footsteps to the left and right of me. Still gripping the earth and afraid, my senses were heightened, and I felt the steady stomping of footsteps move past me. The dust was too thick all around me, but I saw multiple figures just beyond my limited vision moving towards the trench line. No gunshots. The wire team was still safe, or had their throats cut. As the figures moved on, the wind drowned everything else out, and my right arm was almost completely buried. There was nothing to do but go forward. The Legion had walked right past me. Crawling on, I was ever more vigilant. The wind still whipped around me as I continued forward, and just as I passed the 100 marker, I heard the faint gunshots of battle behind me. The trench line was being hit, and I wasn't sure if I had to go back or move forward. I still couldn't see any other members of the wire party until I reached the 150. As the occasional bullet landed next to me out in the no man's land, I saw them. There they were. The faint silhouettes of my buds were working on the wire and fixing the cut lines the Legion made. I did what I could, staying low in the dunes and pounding on the posts with my hammer as the wind drowned out all sounds. I wrapped wire around new posts, and soon enough, a trooper crawled his way towards me and shouted into my ear, "Glad you made it, Ed." Scary profanity with Caesar's boys back at the 100, wouldn't you say? I nodded, and he shouted through the wind, "Wire party's moving back. Let's fix up the rest. And hope our boys at the line are giving them the what for." I crawled my way to the other figure to the west and relayed the message to move back. Upon reaching the 100, we continued the work, fixing up more of the lines and hearing the carnage at the trench a bit clearer through the storm. Repeating the process, we finished and relayed the message to move back 50. Reaching the 50 marker, the sounds of battle essentially halted, and through the dust I saw several figures stuck on the wire. Legionaries were lining the 50 line of wire, and full of new holes. Legionaries never ran away, so I knew something was amiss. I got closer, and just on the trench line side was a bloodied trooper with his hands bound at the foot of the slumped legionary. Just like we'd seen before, the legionaries were dragging our guys into the sand. I approached the man, his goggles were removed, and I heard his words. I said I was a friend, but he didn't believe me as he choked on the sandy air. Quickly, I pulled my bandana from my pocket and tied it around his mouth. He was still blind from having his goggles removed, so I pulled out my extra face wrap and held it over his eyes. I didn't work on the wire, but the sandstorm started to die down, and the other members of the wire team saw similar scenes and helped other kidnapped troopers. The storm rapidly died down to the point we could see the first wire line outside the trench. As visibility came back to the no man's land, I saw scattered dead figures covered in sand, but otherwise red across the area. A challenge was shouted our way as the dust still lingered in the area that asked the phrase, "Who goes there?" One of the wire members called out, "Junktown, Julia. We got wounded out here." The storm faded more and more, and several troopers from the recovery team ran up. I released the poor blind and bound trooper to a private and began working on the wire. The Legion cut 2 lanes in the 50 marker, but likely lost their way back in the storm and got caught on the wire trying to drag off our guys. After fixing the 50, the storm was gone, and we ducked into the trench. The wire team was then met with shock by the troopers who could have sworn we would die as the Legion crossed the no man's. The storm was so thick that they ran right over us, or walked right past. It was quite the experience, so that incident solidified command's dispatch of wire teams during sandstorms. Although, not every wire team would be as lucky. The next job were trapper teams, and those were what you may already expect. Trapper teams had troops go out into the no man's land to lay mines. Those jobs had the same timing issues as wire teams. But the interesting part of trapper teams was how infrequent they were during this time. I say their frequency was interesting because the sandstorms had a unique way of making stationary mines irrelevant. A team could go out into the no man's land at night, lay them out past the 100-yard marker, only for a dust storm to hit the next day. Sometimes, a dust storm could bury a mine beneath 2 feet of sand, making them almost unnecessary. Like, I heard a story on the observation line from a 1st platoon trooper who got everyone's attention. I won't tell his whole story, but I'll try to recall the good bit verbatim. The young trooper corporal said, "So, when me and the wire team reached the 100-yard marker, there was still no sign of Caesar anywhere. This was where my nerves really started to kick me because I was right next to PFC Long when Sarge told him to fix up new presents, mines. He told him that last week's trench company already set them out, but accidentally placed them within the wire team lane, and a new set of trapper boys was needed to put more out proper. I knew for sure that Sarge had it out for me after I made that comment about his hub piece, side girlfriend, and confirmed it because he turned his head to me and said, 'By the way, you got wire duty tomorrow, Corporal. Weather is predicting a big sandy about noon.' I was just told that there were mines accidentally placed along the wire route, and now I was told to go out there. Anyways, me and the wire boys moved past the 100 marker, and I was left in the Almighty's hands. Wouldn't you know it, even the Almighty was out for me too, but in a funnier way. 2 other dust storms had hit since those presents were misplaced, and I hurled my body over a dune, only to explode. You guys may be wondering why I still have all my limbs. Well, that's because, as soon as my body rolled down to the proper place, the sand beneath me erupted. I tell you that these leather chest protectors aren't entirely worthless, because a mine 2 to 3 feet beneath the sand exploded and sent me 6 feet up and still intact. The sound was only a soft thump below the earth, so nobody can tell you about the explosion. But PFC Truman there will tell you he saw his own corporal miraculously flying through the air during that wire party with no other explanation. He went on to say that the Legion surprisingly didn't attack during that storm, and he had 2 broken ribs. The other members of the wire team, PFC Truman Plus, did see the corporal flying through the air during the middle of the storm and had to haul him back up to Forlorn for medical. Apparently, several others from Forlorn Hope experienced similar issues during wire duty. So, trapper teams weren't too beneficial for us, and there's now an estimated 26,000 NCR dollars worth of buried, unexploded mines under no man's land. That may not seem like much, but Command wised up pretty quick, and the Legion definitely made better use of their trappers. More on that later. So, the next dangerous job on the trench line was the recovery team. I probably hinted to what that was about in my story on a wire team, but casualty recovery was their job. It should be no surprise that those on the trench line got hit the worst, since they were the first line of defense unless the 100-yard boys were out. I know I mentioned some of what they did regarding the buried women, but when they weren't hauling bodies up the cliff from an attack, they were pulling out the corpses of those captured. The other scary part of dust storms, if not what was inside of them, was what they might reveal when they pass. The Legion also used the storms for their own parties. If their teams weren't destroying the work of our wiring parties, they definitely had a better trapper team than us. And the storms were always so thick that both Legion and NCR teams could crawl right past each other without even knowing it. Even though both sides occasionally met in the middle, most of the time they were ships in the night. But the horror work of their trapper teams were always shown when the dust storm passed, and then the recovery boys got to work. Sometimes, captives aren't lucky enough to be saved by troopers in the wiring party or whatever, like in my account. Sometimes, the Legion would get away and use a distraction like a raid to do their real work in the dust. Where our trappers buried or placed the mines, the Legion used their captives for a better purpose. As the storm clears, a spotter from the observation line will see a distant object beyond the wire, and a recovery team would move forward to see if it's one of our guys. Occasionally, it would be just an unfortunate soul from the wire team who got caught in the raid. Other times, it would be the return of one of our troopers, but with an added bonus. I think the mined bodies were the worst ones. The Legion knows that we recover our dead or injured from the battlefield, and they exploit that. Based on the dozens of slit Legion throats in the aftermath of any raid, the Legion knows what they're signing up for. Nobody comes for them. But when we go out to get our guys, we'll sometimes find some poor trooper from last week's raid slumped over in the no man's, either dead or alive and awaiting recovery. It shocks the new troopers for weeks on end, but a new member of a recovery team is often horrified when an injured trooper trap sees the recovery boys approach and shout, "Get back." Before exploding, the Legion straps proximity mines to the troopers they capture, haul their crippled or dead bodies back into the no man's during a storm, ready to explode the next group of soldiers just trying to take him or his body home. We didn't lose too many troopers in the blasts. We learned about trapped bodies really fast. Instead, I think the Legion just wanted us to know that those few alive traps were actually already dead, and that we couldn't save them. That's about all I have for that. However, that's not the only kind of trap I've seen on trench line recovery duty. On the clear days, everyone on the trench line can still see the distant crosses on the cliff marking the edge of Nelson. It doesn't take but a stealthy Legion night raid, or another sandstorm for them to give us our fallen back. Just like the women I described mutilated and half buried in the sands, the Legion will take our fallen or captives and lay them out in no man's land. When the recovery team arrives, they will check a body alive or dead for traps, or find a dead one covered in feces, grime, blood, or with pockets full of rats. If the sight of the fallen trooper doesn't impact the poor new trooper on the recovery team, the messy display will spread disease. Feces and different blood are their own dangers, and when the recovery team loads up the unrecognizable trooper onto a stretcher, the sudden movement makes the rats scurry about, and sometimes onto the recovery troopers. Knowing the display will shock a trooper, the Legion takes solace in the idea of our trooper on the recovery team getting knocked out of the fight due to disease in a few days or weeks. There's a whole procedure in dealing with those situations, but I'm sort of done writing about that right now. I will say that recovery teams or the recovery boys was one of the most dreaded tasks for the troopers of Forlorn Hope, but by far one of the most respected. Any trooper who goes into no man's takes a little bit of comfort, knowing that regardless the state they end up out there, the good old recovery boys will bring them back out. The days on the trench line go on, and even when the sky is clear, or it's the middle of the day, the threat of attack isn't completely gone. The Legion didn't do it often, but if they attacked during the day, without a big Sandy, there's a different thing to worry about. If a trooper isn't afraid of what's coming from Nelson, he's afraid of what's coming from Forlorn Hope. I described it a little when talking about the night raid before those captures, but if the Legion makes it to the trench line during the day, the trooper's chance of death goes way up. Not just because of the red-dressed maniacs, but because of friendly fire from the observation line. The observation line is high above behind the trench line, so if the Legion meets the line, the storm of bullets up top is a constant worry for everyone below. Orders to pour it on them up on the observation line means shoot at anything not brown or tan. That is harder to do if you're on the observation line, and all those dots down there are shuffling about. Despite how horrible everyone on the trench line feels knowing that a dust storm could make legionaries jump out at any second, they prefer that because hold fire orders up top are called due to the limited visibility. Compare that to a day attack where, despite the distance, the fire order is called, and a bullet from your friends up top could kill you. Between the heat, more ants than up top, the different teams, the constant fear of attack, watching the crosses, awaiting death, and excavating trenches after sandstorms. I think I can summarize this whole section about the trench line in one sentence. It sucked. But when the week below ends, and if you made it out, the company moves back up top, covered in dust, sweat, and relief, ready for a much-needed shower, and ready to start the new week off the line. An inspiring display. Rotating back to our week off the line, we pass the company headed down and say, "Good luck, troopers. Make Kimball proud." As they curse us on march to their week in the heck below. Back up at the camp, every trooper from the trench line is covered in dust and sand, then ordered to strip down for a company-wide shower. In the center of Forlorn Hope, and surrounded by camp trash, there's a previously clean pool of water. I say, previously, because around the time the women were removed, a logistics trooper was carrying a barrel of radioactive waste from when they kick-started the power generator for the command tent's equipment. Accidentally tripped, and dropped it in. From then on, the thing leaked nuclear waste into the spring, and command caved. The spring became an outlet for the camp's generator runoff/company shower. Command was well aware of this issue, but water was scarce at Forlorn Hope, and we had the supplies to adapt and overcome. So, the company from the trench line is given a plastic bucket and 5 minutes to wash up. Dunking the bucket into the contaminated water, the trooper fills it up and waits for the corporal to show up with a box of Abraxo Cleaner, the miracle detergent. The corporal then sprinkles the powder into the trooper's bucket of murky radioactive water, and then the trooper sloshes it around until they feel they won't mutate. For some reason I never learned, the shower buckets were nicknamed the vats. Anyway, after using your boot brush to get your vital areas, you poured the bucket all over yourself before drying off in the Mojave sun. You are then given 3 more minutes to get dressed and form up with your platoon for a muster. As bizarre and dangerous as the shower may sound, your near-monthly shower was something most troopers looked forward to all the time. Of course, there were other periods to clean yourself up off the line, but nothing quite like bathing in refreshing recently decontaminated water. The on-the-line, off-the-line procedure was common for much of that time, but part of it was changed after about 2 or 3 months, probably post-departure of the women. This big event was when the trench line was discarded. I remember it so clearly because that event was when I heard the most fantastic and inspiring part of probably anyone's Mojave tour. Forlorn Hope was an incredibly depressing place, but if any event there brought out some glory, it was when the trench line fell. Our company was on the observation line at the time when a dust storm rolled in from the west. All guns on the line were pointing out at Nelson even after visibility was almost gone. The Legion had skipped out on any big attacks the past few dust storms, instead using those storms to give us our guys back. But When the dust came in harder, and we lost sight of the guys below, that was when the singing started. I don't know who created the song, or when it was created, but it was more of a chant, or something sounding more like a platoon's running cadence. So, just as we lost sight of the trench line, we heard the song Caesar's Ballad coming through the winds. I believe Caesar's Ballad was named as such because it related to an old world dish called a Caesar salad. I guess the immature trooper who made the song thought if you say Caesar's Ballad fast enough, it'd sound like that vegetable dish. Anyway, we couldn't see the trench line, but we heard them singing the words through the storm. The words went, "Way out east of the Rado, Colorado. There's a small bald man with an ego. He got real tired of washing out, so he took some tribes to prove his clout. Little Lord Caesar was hurt as a kid, enslaved the tribes to do as he bid, never was good with the ladies. So he made them slaves for the babies. His fave old pup was sent to the pound, making up for that with the Denver Hound. He's real smart with the history, but forgot about all of Rome's enemies. Don't say Graham, or he'll get real mad, or Monster of the East will prove he's bad. His best boys from Arizona lost round 1 to Private Fiona. Fiona, female trooper posthumously awarded for courage at Hoover Dam. About 2 verses in, everyone on the observation line joined the choir, still unable to see our lads below. I happily but nervously joined in the chorus as the ominous air of the situation rose. There were more verses to the song chant, but the fast-tempo taunt always ended the same way with, "We're here, Caesar, so don't you pout. Standing in the way of your western route, we showed you once, didn't cost us a buck. So try it again, you old bald profanity." As soon as the last profane rhyme was shouted by us and those below, gunshots erupted through the winds. It continued for seconds and then minutes. The Rangers in the towers couldn't see anything or assist, and the fighting below continued longer than a usual raid. The sputtering of machine guns and rifles continued on and on for far too long. Our LT was given orders to move 2nd Platoon down for assistance, and we threw on our kits to head below. Just as we started the march down the winding trail, the first figures broke through the dust. Thank God nobody fired because it was our guys. The troopers staggered up the cliffs and half of us were designated to help them up while the other half was sent below. I spent the next hour or two helping our limping boys up the hill and escorting them to the dock. The gunfire died out, but the storm continued, and I had no idea what the other half of our platoon was doing below. After another hour, the storm was gone, and an alert trooper ordered our company's 2nd Platoon to muster at the observation line. The other half of our platoon came up as the storm subsided, and we learned that half of the company on the trench line was devastated. Our guys who went below helped mop up, but a little over 30 troopers from the trench line were killed or captured, and the rest were put under the doctor's care. If there was any time for that song to be relevant, it was in that moment. All those troopers went to their end, with the last words they willingly said being a curse to that crazy Caesar guy and his army of psychos. As inspiring as that moment was, the losses there made command deem the trench line as too dangerous to hold. No more troopers were to be sent down below, which was a relief to us on the observation line, and new troops were being mustered from across the Mojave to bolster our ranks. There'd still be 3 companies at Forlorn Hope, and none of the old trench line jobs were going away, but we were consolidating everyone at the camp or observation line. Troopers' morale. Passing time. As more troopers filled the observation line, the memory of losing nearly a whole company remained, and more of the issues with those things came. I mentioned boredom being the primary concern of troopers on the observation line, and thus came more ways to pass the time, some even being required by command. You'd think the removal of the most dangerous line would improve morale, but it didn't, not necessarily at least. Like I said, all the assignments were still there, but now run from the observation line. Troopers would still have to go out and fix the wire, and recover those who got dragged away from the 100 line. The only upside was that the trapper teams didn't have to go too far out into no man's anymore, and their work was more effective. Anti-personnel mines would line the winding trail down to no man's before storms and at night, and since the trail was on rough dirt, the mines weren't buried by sand anymore. On the other hand, between the jobs, There were a lot more troops waiting on the line or filling different watch posts. With more troops in the camp proper, it was easier to allocate sufficient troops for night watch on camp and on the observation line. Also, with more troops manning the offline duties, patrols were extended to the ends of the canyon passes out of camp. So, we were able to better monitor Legion activities along the desert stretching to the 95. Despite the new focus and bodies manning the old jobs, boredom was still a large issue, and many troopers had nothing but time on their hands between Legion attacks. Some of these things were there from the start of Forlorn Hope as a frontline camp, but some were added with the removal of the trench line. In the end, troopers combat boredom and maintain their morale in a few ways. The big morale booster was probably cards. After all, we were close to New Vegas. When I sat down with a group of troopers, I usually saw they were playing Caravan and then left. Caravan was definitely the most complicated game of them all, and surprisingly the most popular. Despite how complicated it was, I once met a trooper who couldn't even read or write absolutely destroy 3 players in a row. I considered myself somewhat smart, but no matter what I did throughout my entire time in service, I couldn't understand it. On a particularly slow day on the observation line, I once spent nearly 12 hours of the shift studying a couple troopers who were having a tournament, asking questions, and making notes about the rules. I don't think I studied that hard since schooling back home, but in the end, I had my chance to play a young hub trooper named Flatwood. Using a spare deck from one of the previous troopers, I instantly forgot all the answered questions and looked to my notes only to see they were chicken scratch. Instead of playing off the trooper's hand, I got up and left the 3 cigarettes I put in the pot as they laughed at my surrender. Joke was on them, since I didn't even smoke. I think they called that game Caravan, because I would rather join a 5-week caravan through Arizona while wearing an NCR uniform than play that game. Anyway, if the troopers didn't play that, they played poker, or freshened up their blackjack techniques during their dreams about New Vegas or New Reno. I enjoyed some poker, and a little blackjack was fun too, but most troopers got really excited for the other forms of losing pay. Some troopers captured hairy desert spiders, or half-radioactive scorpions or ants for fights. Certain kinds of fire ants can grow to the size of a dog or even man, but they were rare around this part of the Mojave. Instead, days on the lines were spent covered in the tiny ones. On the rare chance a trooper found a baby ant with mutation potential, he'd hide it from his corporal and ask around the line for anyone who's got an opponent. Upon finding a challenger, a crowd would form the second a sergeant steps away, and we'd put tobacco products, lower enlisted currency, on who'd win. Even though baby ants were strangely more vicious than baby scorpions, the little nature struggle would commence with their human audience, only for the best part to be missed by a "send 'em out" order. Then there'd be 2 missing creatures loose in the camp. As humans tend to do whenever they're risking something, some troopers drink. Most troopers don't drink because alcohol has a way of dehydrating you in a way that the Mojave was already good at. Troopers also didn't drink because that was a strict no-no in the eyes of anyone with more than 1 chevron on their collar. I never really drank because I never liked the taste, and have seen too many vagrants in San Fran fall victim to alcoholic stupidity. However, another interesting thing about people's habits is that they tend to answer depressions with depressants. For some people, it seems kinda hard not to drink when they watch their best bud in the trench get dragged into a dust storm only to watch them get hauled up on a cross the next day. Whether a trooper wanted the alcoholic beverage to forget, or in order to celebrate their birthday away from home, punishments were still doled out for engaging the habit. It wasn't all that hard to get alcohol. Surprisingly enough, the Mojave Express couriers dropped off forlorn trooper mail at Helios 1, where it was then sorted by a team there for contraband. Some guys at Forlorn Hope were from Helios, and knew a buddy who'd turn a blind eye. Other mail inspectors saw bottles of whatever, and let it through anyway after seeing it marked for a trooper who died upon getting reassigned to Hope. However, some troopers who requested stuff from home were crafty, and tasked friends or family members back home with hiding the shot or 2 in a separated part of a thermos. The mail inspector would then think Private Joe at Forlorn Hope was just getting sent a cup of his mama's homemade soup. Occasionally, the trooper had other less desirable items secretly sent to him, and those were met with their own punishments. If it wasn't alcohol, gambling, training critters for fights, or other habits I'll mention shortly. One universal pastime, regardless of if you and your pal are on alert duty or sitting on the line, was complaining. If someone hears a lower enlisted complaining, you can place good money on a camp veteran interjecting his own bit about how things were worse back in my day. This especially became a point of pride for people who were around when the trench line was a thing. Later on, I would personally go on to tell a new guy or two about how his misery ain't nothing compared to what I had to go through, as if that was some kind of boast. Either way, trooper misery bragging matches were a thing that usually ate up plenty of time before an attack or end of shift. I usually liked to sit back on those because later on, I could almost always win with the whole. I am one of the few survivors from the Nelson garrison. I usually took pride in that, as I saw the face of the complainer I just out-complained. Then I'd think about those moments and how traumatizing that was. Anyway, aside from that, there were a few other ways troopers kept their spirits up, some even mandatory. Shortly after command got rid of the trench line, even they began to fully embrace the common name of forlorn hope. Nobody had told me at the time, or the LT forgot to mention it at formation, but I remember I was sleeping on the observation line before my night shift when I was kicked awake. Sergeant Holmes gave me a light kick. I lifted my helmet up and saw him standing over me, blocking the sun with the widest grin. I struggled to get up into parade rest when he said, "Harton, get yourself up and freshen. It's time for your worship service." That statement woke me up more than standing. I leveled my helmet and asked, "What was that, Sergeant?" His grin was wider than any I'd ever seen on a man of his rank as he clued me in. It's mandatory religious service time. Command knows that morale is in the profanity, and you've always been a chipper one. Now, hurry along and go form up with the Hubologist group by Bravo's shack house. I dropped my military demeanor for the first time since acquiring it. You woke me up for that, Sergeant. I made Hubologist my religion as a joke. I'm not going. Sergeant's grin never wavered. He only reached at the chain around my neck, turned around my dog tag, saw the HUB on there, and said, "Command made religious attendance mandatory for camp morale purposes. You're going, Harton." "No, Sergeant, I am not," I said defiantly to no one as I made my way to the Hubologist meeting. Bravo Company was on the line as well, so we had one of their shacks all to ourselves. There, me and 3 other more devout Hubologists at Forlorn Hope ran our mandatory worship service. I wondered what the other religious groups were discussing or doing. I think the weekly 2 hours of torture weren't too bad, though. We, Hubologists, spent that time discussing the Great Hub and his 3rd book released after his death. And I later learned that the atheists had to spend that time on the line during the afternoon sun. Pros and cons, I suppose. Though I would have rather been sleeping before my night shift, I didn't mind the short break from the line. When it immediately came out to the other Hubologists that I wasn't actually a Hubologist, the AHS-4, most senior member, and corporal from Shady Sands, made me an AHS-1, promising he owed me one Zeta scan when we get home. My parents would have killed me for being titled anything in the weirdo cult that's plagued everyone back home since the bombs, but I at least went to my night guard shift in peace. The peace of mind in knowing that if I was killed by some legionary, I'd join the Starfather on the planet Quetzal. At the night shift, the rest of the observation line was asleep, and I was on the line with the rest of the crew, heads up, and guns pointed at Nelson. Some of them saw that business with Sergeant, and razzed me a bit about my supposed faith. I couldn't help but laugh as well. The night guards around camp or on the line were spent with heads up since the night concealed our visibility from any potential Legion gunners. So, with eyes and guns facing south, the line watched over no man's land for any suspicious movements and swatting ants off our arms. A trooper then puts in a good lip of chewing tobacco, sometimes a dried old pre-war can, or sometimes an organic can from the Coyote tobacco plant. There were a few makers of that natural stuff in the Mojave, whose sole customer was the NCR military. I tried chewing tobacco one time before the trench line was removed, and my world began to spin. The stuff was so potent, and it made me want to throw up. A corporal thought I was coming down with heat stroke that time, and a few recovery boys were about to take me up top. As the corporal began writing down my name for the punishment sheet, I fell from my post on the line, and when the recovery trooper asked, "How many fingers?" I spat the ground leaves from my mouth and said too. Some of the troopers saw what I spit up and laughed, while the corporal ripped up the charge sheet calling me an idiot. Those troopers chuckled at a new trooper's first run with nicotine, and PFC Watley, who gave me the pinch, disappeared into the ether. I got back to my post, and swore I'd never do chewing tobacco again, at least until the night shifts up top got the better of me. Some nights, the constant waiting for a sniper to start firing at a Legion raid team got to your nerves. Feeling my limbs bouncing up and down, I often asked the trooper next to me what made him so calm. The trooper would reply with a long spit off the cliff followed by, "Nothing like a good lip." "You looking to bum a pinch, Harton?" I said, "No way. Too many times in the past, but eventually took it up in an effort to combat nerves and boredom. I entered it with the mindset of a preference to throwing up or making the world spin, rather than sit in the day's heat or chilly night any longer." Yep, chewing tobacco was simply something to do for most people in the military. Starting with the obligatory tiny pinch and moving up, I ended up getting my own cans through buddies or through pen pals, since I thankfully hadn't been found by Mama or Pop. I honestly felt I'd be safer in Legion hands than my adopted parents. Anyway, I'd get me cans through friends, or I'd collect cigarettes in gambling or gather favors in exchange for dip. I did say that I didn't smoke. That was all fine though, because tobacco of all kinds was essentially its own currency at Forlorn Hope. Money didn't have any value since troopers needed tobacco at every moment. Troopers' morale. Pen pals and treats. During the nights were a great time to write letters as well, if you had the light, and could get away with it. But that was a usual way to keep the spirits up on the line if you weren't counting in the day. Again, any second could be interrupted by the shots of a ranger or shout from a trooper, but I spent that time keeping up with my pen pals or patriotic lovelorn people. Troopers usually have plenty of people to write to, and contact is especially frequent if they were recently assigned to Forlorn Hope. I heard stories of people forgetting they even had families when they were assigned to McCarran and were able to frequently enjoy the famous strip. Apparently that changes when they get to Forlorn Hope, because then they start apologizing for things they never did or write a love letter every single day. I was somewhat proud to consider myself a forlorn veteran, and instead did what most troopers who've already written their wills, didn't have families to write to, or already accepted the situation did, try to make things a little less scummy. I've seen too many new troopers letting tears dot their 10,000th letter, that day, to dearest sweetheart. I was more interested in PFC Mickelson, who was writing to his favorite new Reno prostitute and about how she should have added more cigarettes to the care package. I had no real friends outside of Camp Hope, but did feel lonely. Luckily, just before losing the trench line, morale was still in the dirt, and Lieutenant told us about the new Forlorn Fighter list. A trooper could add his name to the Forlorn Fighter list, and whatever else he felt like adding about himself, and the thing would be sent back to NCR for women or men to offer distant companionship. I was a prime candidate for that sort of companionship, but the thing was quickly exploited by everyone who felt like they could get something. I was one of those people as well. PFC E. Harton. Single and a long ways away from San Fran. I enjoy time with my mates off the line, watching the sunrise, and I can't wait to meet you. Though I love serving the unfortunate people of this desert, my first love will always be the ocean around the Bay Area. A beach bum at heart, I knew I had to do my part for the Republic before sitting beside you hand in hand with nothing but each other and a Pacific sunset, maybe with a drink or two. After a fantastic bio like that under my heading, it wasn't too long before I got the attention of a few patriotic NCR women with a thing for soldiers, and one guy. I'm not sure if the Forlorn Fighter list mentioned to the public that there were only men at the camp, or if this list was for all Mojave troopers, but I got myself a boyfriend as well. What a guy he was. He definitely got me the best stuff, and wrote some of the nicest letters. If troopers weren't awaiting death, or getting what they could from people back home, most of them had New Vegas on the mind. Alongside the Forlorn Fighter, another list was added by the duty roster. That one listed a number of the best prostitutes around the strip supposedly made by the MPs there. I suppose it was helpful to those who were ready for leave. Some of those letters exchanged were negotiating prices, asking for pictures, and what was allowed. If the average trooper spent as much time planning for attacks as they did for potential leave trips to New Vegas, we would have beaten the Legion a long time ago. I again wasn't much different. It was hard keeping up with 2 girlfriends and a boyfriend, and sometimes too much. I eventually became one of the guys in the company that even the sergeants asked if I could request something for them. I don't mean to sound ungrateful, or like we were exploiting people back home, but I and we at Forlorn Hope really did appreciate the morale boosts from people in NCR. Whether their gifts were great care packages, or just a few nice words. I didn't hold the camp record for juggling the most pen pals, but I was useful to people who wanted something in our company. My girlfriend, Andrea Walker from Reading, was a rancher's daughter who definitely sent the best jerky or food items. My boyfriend, Damian Torres, worked an accounting job for some big company in the hub and hated sending my chewing tobacco. Although I insisted they were for my friends since I was just content with his words. Then there was Stacy Paisley, who was one of them followers of the Apocalypse, some charity organization that was even in the Mojave, and she sent some fun or interesting books or magazines. I never really got incredibly educated growing up as a crew member of Pop's fishing boat, and that fact was acknowledged by the Boneyard follower member, who described my spelling and grammatical errors as cute. So, they sent me good treats that came in about twice a week. There was no real contraband, so there were no delays. The food, chaw, and books were great, but things were always tense when some private or sergeant requested something unique. I didn't have the guts to ask Stacy for a crate of Cat's Paw dirty magazines, so I'd ask for something like a decent home maintenance magazine that occasionally had pictures of pretty pre-war women doing something or other. Anyways, I always read the letters that accompanied whatever treats, and really liked all 3 of them. Although, things did get strange when they seemed to unanimously decide they wanted to meet me in New Vegas on leave. I stalled Andrea by saying that I wasn't due for any leave, which was true, but more on that later. Then both Damian and Stacy said they'd make the trek to New Vegas and await me after doing the math about how likely my potential leave was by this point. Every trooper, especially troopers at Forlorn Hope, dream of leave. Again, more on that later. But the last thing I wanted was to go to New Vegas and have to introduce one of my girlfriends to my boyfriend. When it finally happened, I would have rather been captured by the folks at Nelson than explain that mess. So, I broke up with my boyfriend to alleviate some of the stress. I initially wrote a letter to Damian saying that I was heading into no man's land in a month. Plenty of time to get a response and maybe explain a thing or two. The letter was sure to emphasize how likely it was that I'd be killed or captured, which was also fairly true. As I calculated the response, I considered faking my own death, but realized how karma would actually get me. Realizing that, PFCE, Harton wouldn't be in the public casualty papers. Hopefully, I decided to come clean. I wrote an eloquent letter, courtesy of Stacy's grammatical criticisms, explaining that I was in fact not a woman of the NCR military. I never said what the E in E Harton stood for, and appreciated all the nice letters he sent me, and great packages. I sent that letter. Not long later, I was on alert duty in a ranger post when a runner handed me the letter. After reading the letter, I was more puzzled than anything. Mr. Torres back in NCR knew that I wasn't a woman, and couldn't figure out why I sent that letter. I wasn't sure what to make of that. I told the ranger the situation, and his static laughter behind the gas helmet didn't help. I was just about ready to turn myself in at the nearest Legion Cross when I decided to write a letter coming legitimately clean. Although, for some reason, I scrapped that idea because I didn't have the heart to tell the poor man that I didn't swing that way, and that I'd been using his incredible kindness primarily for tobacco products. I wrote a letter to the guy saying that I was thankful for all his kind gifts and words, but I simply wasn't ready for a relationship. Later on, I got the response saying that he understood, and that was surprisingly that. A lot of the lads relied on me for the regular tobacco treats from my boyfriend back home and laughed at the situation, or said I should get back together with him with mine solely on regular chaw. Absolutely zero regard to my personal orientation or exploitation of a poor lonely man back home. So, I kept it going with the 2 other women for a long time. Stacy the follower eventually talked about moving to the FO, a outpost near New Vegas, and sent nice thoughtful letters. She never got the relocation approved, but she was great to write to. Andrea still sent the best food items from her ranch, but wasn't the same conversationalist. I think I liked Stacy the best, but Andrea sent the best treats, and wasn't the most talkative like I mentioned. The two differed in a number of ways, but I think the biggest difference between the two aside from the treats was how they wrote. Andrea had a really foul mouth in her letters, and took pride knowing her. Man in the Mojave was on the front line. I don't swear, even as the troopers around me cuss up a storm, and even when I write about the last dreadful thing I saw the Legion do. I suppose she was rough from ranch life, and most of her profanity towards the Legion was explained when she mentioned her older brother dying at Hoover Dam. Every trooper in the Mojave, conscripted or not, was there primarily because of that big battle back in '77. She again wasn't the most descriptive in her letters, but she let loose when talking about that big event. So, the really interesting part of hearing Andrea's story was how forlorn hope was bolstered with some veteran officers of that battle shortly after I got the letter. Morale isn't always good. We got a new doctor who was a veteran of Hoover Dam, and he supposedly had a story about all the work he had to do after the battle. Apparently, he went through some stuff, but the vet story I heard firsthand was after 1st Platoon's LT was killed leading a recovery team. The man died when a mine went off under a barely conscious trooper trap. So, a week later, the boys at Hoover Dam sent a new LT who is also a veteran of the battle at Hoover Dam, and very familiar with the Legion. Bored on the observation line, I was passing out some magazines, of ammo, not nudie mags, this time, to the guys on 1st Platoon's end when I joined a huddle near the Colorado end of the line. Despite being in our company, I never got the new LT's name, mostly because we had to remove our observable uniform tags at Forlorn Hope. Never got the reason why. So, unable to see his dog tag tucked under his chest protector, I got hooked when he thumped said chest protector and said, "Oh, you know, I'd seen old Vetso Kaisar put a machete straight through one of these Brahmin Aussies." I couldn't quite place the new LT's accent. He went on. "Back in enlisted days o' mine, Mojave troopers were a sight to see, and one for running to if you're looking for safety. Old Kaisar really took us by surprise when that crimson wave came pouring down from the East Dam. Gave us a good thrashing, and so much so that we outright lost the thing. I was there up top, when some 7-foot Arizon was staring down the young staff certain looking turn LT. After gun jam, I tried conversing with the fella, thinking the facelessin might at least be courteous enough to hear me out. I say to the beast as he's swinging a machete, 'I know you're one of them Legion boys. Believe me, I know myself a ranger fella who's been swatting at ye guys forever back in Arizona. I get your lord wants this old dam, but I promise you'll have a real rough go of it if we win the day.' None to say, fella wouldn't listen to reason. I was getting a fair winded and I ducked the 20th swing. Finally say to the guy, 'N'kay there,' tried giving a warning. Then I stuck him good with my bayonet, but thing didn't land. Fella was a vet, and the old sports pads lined as sheet metal. Old Chief must have been looking over yours truly 'cause I gave another thrust and landed it in his neck despite my aiming for his machete arm. I surmised he was of tribal descent based on that bit about his old chief looking out for him, which was odd considering his unusually pale complexion and waxed facial hair looking like something out of an Old West comic book about gunslingers. I'll continue his story with my translation. After seeing about the Arizonan, I saw everyone dropping left and right. Legion, troopers, didn't matter. The troopers were getting hacked away, and the legionaries were getting dropped by ranged fire from the sharpshooters in the cliffs or troopers on the rear line. Seeing I was the only one in brown, I knew it wouldn't be long before one of the legionaries picked me as his next target. I fell back, running back to the sandbags of the next line, waving my arms like a maniac and shouting, "Don't shoot! I'm NCR." Considering I was covered in blood, I worried they'd shoot at me. After all, the orders to shoot at anything not tan came from somewhere. Just before reaching the line, the troopers unleashed a volley. To my surprise, I was not hit. Then again, training for troopers was a bit longer in my day. I wouldn't trust some of you guys in the same situation, haha. I'd heard stories of the battle for Hoover Dam before, but none from a guy who was there. He went on. Leaping over the bags, I caught my breath, for 1 second exactly. The next swarm of Legion seemed to follow my lead and piled into the last line. The sharpshooters were doing their work, but legionaries excel because they actually enjoy getting killed or getting crippling injuries. Troopers tend to prefer not dying, and I'm the same. So, we found ourselves in yet another spot. Wasn't long before I got a rifle off a poor trooper who went back home. Joining in the fray once again, Caesar's boys didn't seem to care that their feather heads were dropping, so long as there was a fresh-looking Californian in front of him. Wouldn't you know it? I found myself in the same spot, except this time the red guy had a few feet distance. I guess that's what guns were made for. I was too tired to try and scrap with him. Anyway, there weren't but 15 of us left when someone above my meager enlisted grade ordered us to get the heck out of there. I said, "Say no more," and bolted with the remaining troopers and some of the fellas who were down below during the tussle up top. We all know what happened after the Legion took the dam, but I didn't know this next part. So, me and not but 20 or 30% of the whole damn garrison bolted for the road. I was thinking command said, "You guys can have that place. We don't want it anyway." Ignorant me didn't know that the official order was given to fall back. Needless to say, I was a bit surprised when 2 miles up the road, an officer led the surviving troopers off to an impromptu field hospital at the turnoff to Boulder City. It was then that I finally realized none of the legionaries were following us. I guess I was so used to feeling the swipe of a machete at my back that it became a natural feeling. Yep, you guys heard it before. The Legion won the dam, but they couldn't celebrate their victory with our sharpshooters still picking them off while sorting the holdouts or few they caught. I can't say for sure why the Legion didn't just smash their way below until the sharpshooters ran out of ammo or they got reinforcements. But old Legate Graham ordered the charge forward with his best. Nearly 200 legionaries stormed down the road, chasing the sharpshooters while Hanlon was busy fixing up that little surprise. I was handed an unofficial follower's medical degree at the injured camp outside Boulder City and ended up helping the wounded alongside our new doc here. At the same time, Legate Graham got busy disappointing Caesar with the help of Chief Hanlon. After the big boom in about 2 hours, the few remaining troopers in the whole damn sector were ordered back to Hoover, with Caesar's kids running back east. I swear, that was the only time I saw any legionary run away from a fight. Back at the dam, we got busy bagging up the dead of both us and Legion. You wouldn't think it if you've all seen the sort of action I heard about at this camp, but the Legion has spirits too. We saw them kicking dirt east, and I think I saw old Legate Graham the evening after the battle. I was busy helping stack the dead, but I swear I saw a lone figure looking down at us from the eastern cliffs, seeming to know the failure he made. Then again, you all heard what happened to Graham, and those first crosses atop Fortification Hill were likely decorated by the legionaries who ran. The Legion's fat, if you will. I went, but then he stopped. The new officer was then cut off by the crack of a ranger's rifle from the Colorado watchpost. It was dusk, and those who heard the officer's story felt a wave of inspiration and glory as they aimed their guns south. The order, "Send 'em out," was given, and all guns blared as 2nd Platoon troopers on the western line manned the winding trail, ready for if the Legion made it that far. A few grenade rifles manned the line, sending high explosives out into no man's land, scattering the legionaries who scurried across the barbed wire. Flares popped over darkening landscape, showing silhouettes that dropped slowly to the earth. Troopers on the line ducked at the ranged legionaries' accurate shots from below that occasionally wounded a man on the line or trailhead. The Legion never stopped, and more guns popped off as the fire order turned to, "Pour it on 'em." My witness to the glorious and inspiring spectacle was suddenly interrupted by the shout of my sergeant that pierced through the roar of gunfire. Where the profanity is heartened with the ammo. I was still carrying that crate full of magazines. Seeing a typical Legion dusk raid through the lens of that LT's inspiring story of service made me forget that I was part of what was happening, and that I had a job beforehand. Morale and inspiration aren't always good things. Making my way down the line, tossing ammo at troopers. I completed my assignment, but the delay was noted by my sergeant, who took time out of the skirmish to reprimand me. There were no real casualties in the fight, at least non-lethal, or ones that couldn't be fixed with a stim pack, but Sergeant wasn't too thrilled with me. Apparently, getting caught in a patriotic trance about glorious service to the Republic wasn't a good excuse for delay under fire. He said the Army retired that medical condition with the first draft of '78. I was just amazed that was an actual excuse used by past NCR troopers. Anyway, that was my first time getting added to the crime board. Punishment sheet, discipline roster, correction report, or the sheet occasionally referred to as the MP cat's paw. Punishments and proud serving. Even though the punishment sheet had many different names depending on who's looking at it, I'll refer to it as the crime board for the sake of clarity. Although, I feel it's necessary to explain that last name for it, the MP Cat's Paw. Cat's Paw is an old magazine from the pre-war days with pictures of beautiful women that people today still use for stress relief. The MP part of the crime board comes from troopers on the strip who got in trouble by the military police. The MPs in New Vegas had their own crime board, but the relation between that and the magazines comes from angry troopers. Even though Forlorn Hope didn't have MPs, when a trooper is added to the crime board, they'll typically accuse the superior who added them of getting some form of erotic release by seeing the name they added. There you go, MP Cat's Paw. I mentioned my almost getting added to the crime board for my first experience with DIP, but delaying with the ammo that evening got me a Light Camp Discipline Level 1, or CDL1. You could get a CDL1 for a lot of offenses, and I heard the punishments were easier in other Mojave duty stations. But Forlorn Hope was the front line against the Legion, so discipline was elevated just a tad. There were a few punishments for the CDL1, but the most common ones were assignment to the 100-yard line, or miscellaneous punishments like the one I got for my offense, permanent alert duty, or permalert. The evening I was added, the 100-yard squad was full. Apparently some big incident filled up the list for the next few weeks, and that crew stopped getting volunteers a long time ago. Anyway, on permalert, a trooper is literally forced to play courier for however long their punishment is deemed, 4 days in my case. Part of that had me accompany a ranger in a tower for that duty, though the part of alert duty in the towers were usually a decent gig. It was made worse by the day hours spent running orders and reports around camp or to patrol teams. It was worse because I spent the days fighting hard not to pass out from the sun, and then had to spend nearly the entire night in a tower, knowing that if I pass out, the punishment would be extended. What I would have given for a Legion attack on those nights. The gunshots would have woken me up with the adrenaline buzz. But no, Caesar himself knew I was in the tower those nights and had his boys at Nelson take a break for my entire punishment duration. Instead, I spent the days fighting heat stroke, and then spent the nights fighting to stay awake. It didn't help that the ranger in the tower wasn't particularly talkative, and so I had to resort to smacking myself, counting down the hours until 4 a.m. when I was authorized 5 hours of sleep. I did spend some of those nights thinking about a lot of things, but mostly ways people got a CDL1 and how to avoid them in the future. I said the CDL1 was the lighter punishment, but that could be taken differently if you spent too much time 100 yards out. But, aside from delaying under fire, a person could get a CDL1 for multiple reasons. Probably the most common way people got CDL1s was by doing something they shouldn't during their time off the line. Having too fun of a time with your squad mates on guard duty. CDL1. Failure to report to mandatory religious morale service. CDL1. Said something unflattering about your corporal's hub piece. You get a mark for creating unit friction and a CDL1. You're feeling sad that Forlorn Hope isn't as pleasant a duty station as Helios 1. Stop adding camp morale problems and cheer up with a CDL1. That's right. You can get permalert or sent 100 yards out by not being happy enough during a Legionite raid. You can get a CDL1 for a lot of other things, and permalert again wasn't always the punishment. Sometimes it was extended guard duty, extra patrols, or even camp janitorial work. Occasionally, the punishments for a CDL1 were creative. I remember seeing one guy who was forced to sweep the sand outside the command tent. When asked about why he was sweeping sand outside a tent built on sand, he said, "Sarnt caught me writing a letter to his wife, asking her to send some pics to chill him out a bit. Not my place, I suppose." So, as poor as getting a CDL1 and seeing your name on the crime board was, I suppose it wasn't as bad as the other levels. Next up was of course a CDL2. Those could be gotten for another number of ways, but the most common was heat stroke. I know I mentioned that earlier, but heat stroke in the Mojave Sun was still a common thing, and still punishable. Fights, on the other hand, were the second most common source of CDL2s. Most fights were started on the observation line when people were becoming a bit too careless or agitated at the nothingness. Sitting in heat, waiting for attack, and chatting eventually leads into talk that goes a bit too far. What usually sets that off is a comment about what some trooper wanted to do with Trooper Bob's sister when the first trooper thought he wasn't heard. Pile all the terrible conditions I mentioned in previous sections, and you get what looks like a spark in a room full of gunpowder, but with more fists. Either way, a CDL2 usually also involved getting put in the camp jail for 2 to 3 days depending on the crime, and was its own process. I'll use the heat stroke example to elaborate. Once the trooper passes out and is discovered, they are carted to the dock where they are brought back to life, given plenty of water, and plenty of food to get their strength back. Then, the trooper is docked pay for the extra resources he wasted, escorted to the jail, given time to recuperate, and then given half rations as punishment. Since we almost never got Legion prisoners, the jail was still used plenty by us, and was predominantly full of troopers who simply failed to hydrate. Again, the jail and half rats, half rations, weren't too bad, but accompanying the CDL2 was a mark on the trooper's record, reduced pay, and even higher priority on the 100. Next, but not last, was a CDL3. Though fairly rare, the CDL3 was almost the worst thing someone could get for things that aren't treason. I have seen a number of troopers from the other companies executing the punishment or receiving it. How to get a CDL3 was largely unknown to most troopers stunned by constant discipline and fear of attack, but I do remember meeting one man who got such a punishment. He was a supply man who came in with one of the innumerable caravans during the Camp Hope fortification, back when we still had Nelson, and ended up sticking around when it fell. His name was Corporal Oscar Hutzke. I only remember his name because of my time off the line shortly after the women left. My group's guard post was along the Colorado end, sandwiched between the Ranger Watch Tower and the supply tent. Me and the fellas chatted rather loudly sometimes since the Legion almost never tried to cross the Colorado at the point we guarded, and occasionally heard a man chuckle on the other side. Eventually, the man made his own window in the tent side and joined us in our talking between the LT's rounds. Usually, corporals felt like they were too high and mighty for the lesser PFCs, specialists, or privates, but Hutzke was a rather friendly one, and very pleasant company. He was a slim man of lighter complexion, and bore the same forlorn hope makings of a beard that most troopers had at this point. He was the assistant to Quartermaster Mays, and dealt directly with camp supplies. He definitely had some great jokes and funny stories to lighten the mood. But when some of my mates mentioned the moonshine their girls back home smuggled them, I'd later understand why his fate spelled CDL3. Corporal Hutzke said, "Your gal smuggled you a bottle of shine in that loaf last week. Amateur move if you ask me, ha." Many troopers think themselves pretty crafty in getting their contraband past the mail inspectors. Needless to say, they were a bit intrigued about the corporal's statement. He went on to vaguely say what he did for the camp in his off time, and it wasn't in a command-authorized capacity. We knew little about the man. All he said during that time off the line was that he was from New Reno and moved around a bit. When asked about what he did before joining the Army, he said, "I got a knack for knowing what people want and how to get it to them." Some of my squad mates more familiar with New Reno knew what that meant, although the corporal knew us fairly well through our jawing and knew to say, "Nope, not that. There's more things people need in Reno than that profanity." They were talking about drugs, but that wasn't what he gained a reputation for. I still don't know how he did it, or where he got his surplus of items, but he really did help the camp through his side business. If a trooper got a new toothbrush before he could write a request from home, it was from Hutzke. If a trooper felt a bit too lonesome, he got some photographic assistance from Hutzke. He was essentially an unofficial camp store. If you needed something strange or practical, and couldn't wait for someone back home to send it, you'd probably be able to trade a few cigarettes or a pinch of chaw for it with the corporal. I eventually had my own reputation for getting things from my 2 girlfriends and boyfriend pen pals, but after learning about the corporal and having a full queue from others, I'd always say, "Go find Hutzke." The man intrigued me, since I've always found stories about my fellow troopers interesting, and I never learned exactly why Hutzi joined the army. However, I did learn that he willingly joined the logistics corps and was fairly disappointed by being here at Forlorn Hope, but who of us wasn't? He had great stories from the streets of New Reno, but never much about the last engagement with the Legion, always joking. 100 yards out. What's that? That must be some infantry profanity. Yes, sir. I'm a pogue and proud of it. Ha. The logistics guys were part of the HQ company and had all the ego that came with it. Though all of us were in danger of a full-on Legion wave, the HQ company that ran the camp operations were largely exempt from the on-the-line duties. Hutzi's safe position was only solidified by the fact that officers from across the camp came to him for the same thing we troopers did, whether that be new undershirts or packets of coffee. But his comfort later got to his head, and I started off by talking about his CDL3 for a reason. When you start thinking the rules don't apply to you, that's when you open the door for trouble. Probably the most useful man in camp was turned into the camp's enemy almost overnight. I never caught the details, but I heard it had something to do with graduating from under-the-table sock supplier to chem pushing. The very thing he initially said he didn't do from disgust. 2 privates from Alpha were caught with drugs, and they instantly ratted their supplier to avoid their CDL4s in exchange for CDL3s. Orders from McCarran say drug pushers in the army are to be hanged or shot, and I must have not heard the whole story because I was on the trailhead part of the observation line one day when the famous Corporal walked past me at dusk with the rest of the 100-yard squad. His CDL3 involved the standard punishment of daily flogging, jail, reduced rations, and permanent duty on the 100-yard line. No longer was he the man to go to for extra things a trooper might need. He spent his days in the camp jail alongside the other CDL3 or 2 recipients, given a daily meal of 1 can of beans and a small slab of meat, and only taken out for 10 lashes from the HQ night guard officer before grabbing a rifle to join the 100-yard line. He never made that joke about the 100-yard line again. I never learned how long a CDL3 lasted. 1s and 2s were only carried out over a few days, but after the trench line was removed, I'd see Corporal Hutzi walk with the rest of the 100-yard boys and head down dusk after dusk. The punishment never got to him the way it did some others. Treat a trooper with daily jail, beatings, and less food, then give him a rifle and the 100-yard assignment, and he may use it on himself. But not Hutzi. He headed down to the no man's land night after night, rifle on his shoulder, and returned in the mornings. He lost a small piece of his fun-loving and charming salesman personality every night until he didn't come back. A couple weeks before my CDL1, I was on the night watch on the observation line when the gunshots came from the 100. Too dark for us. The day boys awoke with guns facing south while the Rangers with night vision did their work. Another Legion raid repelled by the 100-yard line, but at the expense of a few conscripts and regulars of the MP Cat's Paw. The sun rose. Everything was silent, and the 100-yard squad came back. Our LT asked for a brief on the raid last night, and one of the CDL1 troopers responded with a sigh. Caesar finally got Hutzi. No need to send a recovery team. Legion will probably give him back or have him decorate a cross. Sure enough, hours later, a new cross was erected on the cliffs of Nelson, just out of mercy range. Corporal Hutzi ended up as just another tan-fatigued skeleton to decorate one of the crosses on the other side of the no man's land. So, the last punishment a trooper on the front could get was a CDL4, which was plain and simple, death. I'd only heard of one trooper who got that punishment, but heard only rumors about how the punishment was carried out. A trooper from who knows where was caught trying to desert, and though I'm sure he wasn't the only one. He was picked up by an armed escort from McCarran and taken there. Word says that he was shot at the NCR's primary HQ in the Mojave. There was a post jutting out from the side of the generator shack that grew stories around it. Around side from the spring, the post stuck out of that scrap building, and troopers whispered to one another that it was for hanging deserters. Though none of us had seen that happen, the bit about the guy taken to McCarran put those rumors aside at least for a while. Put any group of soldiers together, and they can make a story about what a particular rock is used for. But it was true that CDL4 meant the NCR had no more use for you anywhere. I'm not sure how I heard this, But command would have shown the depressed at forlorn hope what desertion or other CDL4 crimes meant. But I guess they didn't want to decrease the already low morale. We already knew what was worthy of execution, and they didn't want to constantly remind us. If we needed a reminder of what certain death looked like, all one had to do was look at the crosses on the cliffs around Nelson. All that said, I never saw a CDL4 carried out, but I heard stories from other companies occasionally wondering where Trooper so-and-so went. The troopers would look south, not see him, or be unable to see him, and conclude that he learned the extent of NCR discipline. Minds would wander and sadness would hit, but then the Legion would attack again. All the while, the troopers knew at least Trooper so-and-so deserted in the right direction. Deserting south was probably a lot worse than the other directions. Still though, whatever actually happened to Trooper so-and-so didn't matter anymore since he was no longer helping his pals repel that next assault. So, whether you were sleeping on watch, caught with contraband, passed out from the heat, fighting with your pal, or trying to desert your mates, there were a lot of different ways to be punished. The punishment always brought down the victim's morale, but regardless the tragedy stemming from those at Nelson or those in a green beret, there was one light that was always still there no matter the darkness. And no, it wasn't the light of the Starfather's beacon from Quetzal. That light was the one you could only see on particularly dark nights glowing over the northwestern mountains.